Okay. Um, so when we in Rios look around the world, it seems to us we're in a decisive decade. We're immersed in crises of geopolitics, health, climate, race, that none of us can resolve alone or only working with our friends or colleagues, even if that's what we wanted to do. And last year gave us inspiration for investing heavily in how to work more systemically and more innovatively across these challenges. And we're exploring how to collaborate in new ways for greater impact. So to offer you some of our learnings about collaborating with impact, we've launched a series of webinars that bring together our colleagues and partners to share some of their learnings in things they're doing right now. And after this webinar, we'll encourage you to bring your own challenges to us so we can explore together what might work in your unique context. For those of you who don't know us well, Rios is an international social enterprise that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable challenges. We design, facilitate, and guide multi-stakeholder events, processes, and multi-year platforms with teams, organizations, sectors, nations, and regions. We operate globally and also locally in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Geneva, Johannesburg, London, Melbourne, Montreal, and Sao Paulo, on social inclusion, education, energy, climate, health, equity, natural resources, land, food, peace, governance, and democracy. And what I think is exciting, at least for me, about Rios is that we're constantly learning, including learning what works and doesn't work, often the hard way, and what kinds of changes and systemic impact that collaboration can create. So in the webinars we're hosting this week, we've invited a few of our partners to reflect on some of their biggest learnings from 2020. So I'm going to ask our three panelists to turn on their videos so that I can introduce them. First of all, we have Dr. Marcia Anderson, the Executive Director of Indigenous Academic Affairs at the Ongomzin Indigenous Institute of Health and Healing, part of the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Manitoba. I and others in Rios have had the privilege of working with Marcia and her colleagues in an initiative that was called Wabung Our Tomorrows Imagined. Marcia joins us today from Manitoba. Thank you, Marcia, very much for joining us today. Fabio Almeida is the Organizational Effectiveness Manager with the Laudes Foundation. Fabio has been a key partner in the amazing sustainable fashion laboratory in Brazil. He joins us today from the Netherlands. It's a pleasure to have you also, Fabio. And Belén Gomez works with Rio Uruguay Seguros, an insurance company in Argentina, where she's the coordinator of the corporate university and institutional management of the board of directors. Belén has been a participant in the second cohort of the Inclusive Insurance Innovation Lab, which Rios delivers in partnership with GIZ, the Access to Insurance Initiative, and the Global Leadership Academy. Belén joins us today from Argentina. Thank you very much for being here, Belén. And my daughter's name is Belén, so I like saying the word Belén. Okay, as you listen to today's speakers, I invite you to type your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. Please type in both your question and the name of the panelist the questions addressed to. Okay. Let me just finish by providing you with a brief overview of the Rios 2020 Learning Report, which was the inspiration and the starting point for today's conversation. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Here we go. So just to take 30 seconds for this. This was a report we put out last year of our learnings from this terrible and disruptive and confusing period, which continues for many of us and in many parts of the world. The report was based on our work with partners all over the world, 130 projects in 33 countries, and the learnings that we emphasize that our three panelists will speak to are the 5 that are on the screen now. Imagining what's possible enables more effective crisis response. Working systemically reveals strategic opportunities. Relationships enable timely responses. Working towards decolonization supports resilience, and working experimentally can reduce the devastation of future crises. Okay, so good. So let's start. We've asked each of our panelists to help us better understand the learnings that I've referred to, and I'm going to invite each of them to briefly share with us a bit about the project they've worked on with us and how the story of that project from their perspective illustrates some of the learnings that I've just shared. Again, please share your questions throughout the session. We'll gather them and get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A period. So first of all, I invite you, Marcia, please go ahead. I don't think you link. You can stop sharing link, but please go ahead, Marcia.
Okay. Thanks, Adam. Hamatakio pe potato tuana makie chante washte na pe chuzapaye. So my name is Marcia Anderson. I just shared a bit of the Dakota language with you in introducing myself. And I am speaking today from my place just outside of Winnipeg. And we often start our introductions with also an acknowledgement of the land that we are both on and from. And I am really honored to live and work in the same territory that my ancestors lived and worked in for many, many, many generations. Wabung was the process that we entered into with Rios as part of our First Nations Health Transformation Project. So First Nations people in Canada being one of the original peoples of these lands. And I would say the status quo that we had a shared understanding of as unacceptable was that non-First Nations leadership in First Nations health does not provide the services that we want or produce the outcomes that we are entitled to in a rights-based framework, understanding that we have an equal right to the highest attainable standard of health. That lesson around decolonization and decolonizing really is around removing the colonial forces of domination that pervade currently how First Nations health services are constructed and delivered, to create space for First Nations leadership as a necessary step for healing and wellness. And what I would say around this is that while there is unanimous agreement amongst First Nations people that there needs to be First Nations leadership in First Nations health, how that actually gets enacted, there is not unanimous agreement on. There is a diversity of views, and there are multiple solutions that can exist at different levels of scale. And so part of our goal for this project was really to focus on those First Nations relationships and viewpoints in how we imagine a different possible future, and working with Rios and setting that container and helping with the process to imagine what those futures can be. Now, one of the first lessons that we learned and was, strongly reinforced to me throughout this process and has been since, is that Aiming for a decolonized result requires a decolonized process. And so it would be very hard to see the Indigenous-led, Indigenous-focused outcomes that we would want to see if our process was not infused with Indigenous leadership, ways of knowing, and ways of being. Now, the challenge of this is, and continues to be, that the forces of colonization are so pervasive in our lives. And as a physician, I'm a Western trained medical provider. I work in two large Western institutions, both having a role as a practicing public health physician with government and my academic leadership role in the university, but with very strong community membership and community mandate for the work that I do. But I mentioned that because those forces of colonization are both internal to us as First Nations people and external. They are internalized and externalized. They occur at the individual and the collective level, and we have to be constantly reflective of the diverse ways that these show up in our processes and cause tension. One of the biggest ways that this expressed itself during the process, and that we had some good laughs around and was featured in some of Adam's writing afterwards, was the need to constantly pivot and to be constantly creative, to have that quick understanding when we were not on the right path, that the path wasn't working, and then to reconvene and try a different path as quickly as possible. And this came up from the moment we opened our first workshop. And we had a joint facilitation team from Rios and with First Nations members. And we had lots of discussions about all of the different activities and exercises that would be run. And when we're talking about introducing ourselves as First Nations members, we knew this could go on and take the whole first day if we didn't have some limits or some boundaries around it. And so we agreed, and this is just one quick example, to use the bell and the timer process. We got a lot of negative feedback around that, and the timing was something we had to constantly adjust. Recognizing that it was going to take more time and more space to build trust in us as individuals, in us as a team, and in the process, also meant we had to pull back on the agenda and slow things down so that trust could be built. And one of the other lessons from this that I wanted to quickly mention was we had to both allow and accept that multiple truths exist simultaneously and that actually not everything needs to be reconciled. And so we had tried at the beginning to integrate a process with knowledge keepers or elders right into the same kind of container, if you will, for this process. But that was a tough thing to reconcile actually for a variety of reasons. And so we had to allow both to be important, but also to honor both as needing some separate space, working together in parallel and ultimately braided together again at the end to contribute to the wellness we're imagining in the future. Now, a couple of the other lessons I just wanted to touch on in this time of crisis, and my closest colleague Melanie and I have reflected on this often since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which really hit Manitoba in March of 2020. And that first lesson around imagining what's possible during the time of crisis. We have really built on what we've learned from Wabung in implementing a First Nations-led COVID-19 response. And this came with the mandate of formal organizations, including the federal government, where I now work as a public health officer, including our academic institution, with the dean giving us kind of permission to devote our time for this and to operationalize a response. And then also from the First Nations communities themselves, through a mandate from the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. And we knew that this First Nations-led response was going to bring the best response for First Nations people. And by imagining what was possible that was different from the status quo, and then also leveraging our relationships across systems, some of the notable things that we've been able to accomplish that really have illustrated the lessons we learned in Rios and lessons from the report to me was we put out a call for search supports for people who already have substantive positions elsewhere to join our rosters to provide more support to First Nations communities when they're in an outbreak situation with COVID-19 or for the massive vaccine rollout that we are in the middle of. And because of the time we've invested in building our reputation and aligning our staffing models with our values and principles, we have filled those rosters. We hit over the more than 300 we needed for our vaccine rollout in under a week. And we have successfully deployed teams to support First Nations communities with our rapid response teams more than 80 times. We have new collaborations across multiple levels of government where we are actively working to decolonize and neutralize existing power imbalances to better serve Indigenous peoples. And so working actively through the federal and provincial kind of stuck ideas of who does what when it comes to healthcare services, and finding new ways to leverage funding from the federal government to support, for example, cultural safety and wellness aspects of a model, funding from the provincial government to do the clinical aspects, which are considered insured health services in Manitoba, and partnering with Indigenous community organizations that have not previously had clinical roles in First Nations health to lead Indigenous community-based, Indigenous serving, culturally safe, high quality testing and vaccine services. So thank you for the opportunity to share that and to be in space with you today.
Thank you very much, Marcia. For me, the experience of working with you and our colleagues in Manitoba was a very strong one, mostly, at least for me, in realizing how what I knew from elsewhere wasn't necessarily applicable on that land. And I think for me, that's at least one of the aspects of decolonizing our methods, which was, as we've discussed many times, a huge learning for me. So thank you very much. Some of you are already posting your questions in the Q&A button below. Please keep doing that. We'll come to those after the three speakers, but now we'll hear from Fabio Almeida from the Sustainable Fashion Lab and the Loudis Foundation. Please go ahead, Fabio.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, the colleagues from RIOS, for this invitation. It's really a pleasure, and it's fantastic to be here to share some of the learning we've had by collaborating with the Sustainable Fashion Lab Brazil over the last around 3 years. So first of all, for those who don't know Loudis Foundation, which I work for, we are a philanthropy organization dealing with the dual crisis of social inequality and climate change. In summary, we provide grants to organizations trying to bring about systems change in a few chosen industries that are related also to our mandate and our governors, and which are particularly impactful in terms of environmental and social aspect. So we're working with fashion, finance, and construction, basically. And like RIOS, we also value learning as a cornerstone of our work. We devote a lot of efforts to the improvement of our monitoring and evaluation processes, which result, of course, in our learning and improvement of our practices, also internally at Loudis. And as important as learning, we believe it is to share those learnings and to make it public. So if you go to Loudis webpage, you can find all external evaluations we conduct in any initiative, and even the evaluation that we conducted over our own work and our own role as a funder. But today, of course, I'm not here to talk about Loudis. I'm here to talk briefly about this initiative that we funded since its very early stage, which is the Sustainable Fashion Lab Brazil. So having RIOS as facilitator and leader of the initiative, actually, we convened several key stakeholders around the idea of addressing the main challenges of the Brazil's fashion industry around 3 or a bit more years ago. We started with the transformative scenario methodology, which I'm sure is not new to any of you. And we identified 4 different scenarios for the industry in 2035. With the scenarios in hand, in a group of more or less 60 industry leaders who are now learning how to collaborate around a common agenda for the industry, we started also to prototype some interventions. Without going very much into details of the several initiatives we prototyped and were rolled out over the last 2 years, more or less half the time we've been working with the lab. The fact that the lab has been consolidating into the main reference for sustainability in the fashion industry in Brazil. But of course, you know, as all the challenges we had in our countries were not enough, COVID came in the beginning of last year. And the Sustainable Fashion Lab, as any other network, social organization, or movement in Brazil, had to change completely the plans and everything that was expected for 2020, and also, unfortunately, for 2021, with the long-lasting impacts of the crisis in Brazil. But the interesting thing to see is that the stage that we found ourselves in with the lab also allowed the initiative to develop very quick responses. So since the beginning of the crisis, there were more or less 20 meetings in which the members designed together responses to the crisis. And I would like to highlight 2 of them. One of them that was already highlighted on Rio's report, and another one that I believe is also quite important. So starting from a more strategic perspective, the members of the lab co-created 10 strategies for economic recovery post-COVID, but of course built on very strong sustainable principles. We know how challenging it is and how easier it is to just, you know, roll out the very same economic recovery strategies that we've been using for the last 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. But now what the lab is proposing is that we do it in a different way. We do it based on very strong sustainability principles. This process is now going to public consultation and of course can ultimately inform policy making for the sector, which is one of the priorities of the lab since its creation and something that we've been pursuing as a group since the beginning. And the second example, which is a more direct response and also mentioned on Rio's report, is the pivoting of one of the lab's initiative into producing masks and other health protection items to offer to vulnerable groups. And of course, this initiative was already employing marginalized groups, paying fair wages, and inspiring many other small enterprises to prove that a new business model in the sector is also possible and is also possible to be mainstream. And as Rio's report outlined, this is a great example on how robust relationships across the system can enable effective and timely responses in a crisis. So of course, all this is to say that the lab does not have a lot of challenges. So recently we conducted an external evaluation on the impact of the initiative, which confirmed actually that we are on the right path and really valued the achievements that the initiative has accomplished so far. But there's a lot more to do before we can say we changed the fashion industry in Brazil. Particularly, I'm a believer of the initiative and the group we form and the potential of this process. But we have also to acknowledge that we are dealing with a very complex context in Brazil, even more complex now with the crisis. A big challenge, which will be recovering from the crisis. Actually, Brazil is now facing the worst moment since the pandemic started. As you all know, we have a national government that have played down the risks we're facing from the very beginning, which makes initiatives like the Sustainable Fashion Lab and many other initiatives led by industry leaders and social organizations even more important. So to end this presentation, I'll keep it short and be open, of course, for debates and questions and further information that I could provide. But I would like also to acknowledge the great effort that the Rio's team in Brazil has put on the project and the strong skills and competency of the team. So particularly thank you, Crystal, Lucilene, Taine, and Alcali, who has joined the team recently. And yeah, I stop here. Thank you again, Adam. Thank you, the team, for the invitation, and I'll be available for the questions and debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabio. I was struck by two things in your presentation. Firstly, we often think about these initiatives as being coming up with new ideas, and that can be important, but also it's the ideas plus the relationships plus the capacities that allow us to deal with the situation in front of us. And the second point, your final one, is there is a context which is maybe slightly subject to our influence, but certainly not subject to our control. And in the case that you mentioned, the context of COVID, the context of the economic and political situation, we have to find a way forward in the reality of the situation, which is not easy and not straightforward. So thank you very much, Fabio. As before, if you have questions for Fabio or any of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We'll come to them. But finally, I would like to invite Belén Gomez from Argentina, who participated or is participating in the Inclusive Insurance Innovation Lab. Por favor, Belén.
Thank you, Adam. I will share. Okay. My name is Belén Gomez. I am PhD in economy. At the moment, I am working for Uruguay Seguros, an insurance company in Argentina. I am coordinator of the corporative university of the company and responsible for inclusive insurance. Today, I'm going to share with you our learning in a year of crisis from the Inclusive Insurance Innovation Lab. So, first of all, I'm going to introduce the lab. It's made up by India, Rwanda, Morocco, and Argentina, with the purpose of developing innovative solutions to these challenges, so that more people can be protected from the consequences of unexpected events in their lives. This insurance covers different segments or groups of the community that are underserved by our industry, including lower income households. I will present the learning that taught us the most during our sessions, both national and international. We talk about learning number 5. Working experimentally can reduce the devastation of future crises. On 3 lines of actions: prioritizing customer needs, testing, refining, and retesting new and innovative ideas, creating solutions that work in the real world. In fact, the method that marked a turning point for our cards, especially in Argentina, was to survey and prototype. First, taking an experimental approach, the country courts are prototyping solutions that can provide insurance for informal domestic workers in Argentina, low-income households in India, farmers and youth in Rwanda, vulnerable people in Morocco. In second place, prototyping, the 4 countries agree on an urgent need to generate insurance awareness. This was a real discovery and challenge that we will have to work internationally, but not locally. I'm going to specify some aspects of this methodology. As an example, with the case of Argentina. We choose as a segment domestic workers. Why? Because they are a priority, both they and their needs. 70% of those with the lowest income in Argentina are women. the main economic activity is domestic work. It is also the worst paid, with higher levels of informality, and the most affected by the pandemic. The results from the survey are: they care about their health and that of their children. When they get sick, they lose income from work. They are concerned about losing their bags or bicycles in a robbery. Insurance seems a long way off. They need a tangible experience. In most cases, they are the main sources of income for their households. The use of smartphones is high, but they prefer a first personal contact. They care about training because they have an entrepreneurial spirit. Based on these results, we create 2 prototypes to answer the following questions. First, how can we connect with people to see the power of insurance? Based on social networks, sample languages, telling real and everyday stories. Focused on young people, young women. They don't make long-term decisions, thinking that there are other coverages. For example, health, house. Generate a useful insurance concept, reversing the distorted picture of insurance: expensive, inaccessible, unnecessary. The second prototype is a freemium model, a platform that allows you to sell microinsurance with free courses on sales, techniques, and products, scholarships to become PAS. In Argentina, PAS is like an intermediary. New distribution channels, for example, Spotify, and call center with domestic workers. Generation of a sandbox and a sponsorship of companies and organizations. Finally, we also learned other lessons. Imagining possible scenarios enable more effective crisis responses. Our market is not in the habit of designing products recreating possible scenarios. The supply creates its demand. Our industry creates standard products for standard needs or legal requirements in a very comfortable and predictable way. But the pandemic shook the market and its intermediaries. Second, working systemically reveals strategic opportunity in a crisis. Was not method of studying and researching, selecting a segment, knowing needs and knowing what it needs as a priority and how it's needed, designing accessible products and distribution channels, prototyping, testing, consulting, acting systemically, orders team, makes them more productive and effective to generate impactful social innovations. Relationships across a system enable timely response to the crisis. Social change and now also technical change happened long before normative change. Forming work teams from the beginning with regulators, public bodies, international organizations, and companies gives agility, essential agility when it comes to inclusive insurance. People have needs that they cannot submit to the bureaucracy. From our industry, we can contribute to a more equitable and resilient world in the face of the crisis. We must act with conviction, methodology, and humility to learn daily. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belén. I'm I'm really struck, maybe even overwhelmed by this story, not just because the context is so difficult, but because this, what you and your colleagues have done, which is to use a collaborative platform, not just to meet, not just to talk, but to actually act and to find your way forward is, yeah, it's the holy grail of multi-stakeholder work. So, so thank you. Okay, please, again, I encourage all of you to add your questions now to the Q&A box at the bottom, because we have a good amount of time to interact with Marcia, Fabio, and Belin. So we'll go to that now, but please put your questions in the Q&A and also put the person who your question is directed to. We won't have time to answer all of the questions, but we'll continue the conversation on social media following this event. So I invite my three colleagues to turn their videos on, please. Also, Marcia and Belin, please. Thank you. And I'm okay for Marcia. This is like waiting for the question or for the envelope from for the Oscars. So here it is. Marcia, which were the most precious learnings that you might share with other minorities who want to follow the same steps as you did in this project? I'm hearing that you decolonized your process while you were engaged in the dialogue. It's a powerful model for change. What characteristics or abilities of non-Indigenous partners make them more successful in doing such important process work? So Marcia, please.
Yes, thank you. And thanks to the people who submitted those questions. They're really great questions. Some of the most precious learnings. So one thing I would say is our team was stronger because of the balance between First Nations and non-First Nations facilitators. So it wasn't just my view as a First Nations woman. We had actually a team, a cohort of First Nations facilitators and a team and a cohort of non-First Nations facilitators. And so even within that was a space with a variety of different viewpoints, but also as an individual First Nations person, it is much easier to negotiate that space with the support and with the knowing that there are other people in the group who will understand the worldviews, the contexts, the values or teachings that we may have been raised or have different experiences in. So the multiple people on the team was a real benefit for that. Within our team, even amongst the First Nations people, I would say we had different levels of comfort with trying different methods that Rios used, but we all had to be willing to try them to some extent and give them a chance. And so I think when we're talking about working with both First Nations and non-First Nations facilitators, and we certainly want our non-First Nations facilitators to also be willing to learn from us and adjust the processes that way, that some of the shared space means we also are listening to them and learning from their experience and willing to try some of those processes, right? I mean, we had to be, otherwise we wouldn't have partnered with Rios in the first place, but that's actually a continuous choice that needs to continue to be made by everybody on the facilitation team, that we're all willing to listen and learn from each other and to experiment and try new things and to shift the course. But I think, you know, in any of those spaces, in any negotiation, we have to know what can't be negotiated away, right? What you can't compromise on. We can compromise on time. We can compromise on the number of exercises we fit into an agenda. We can't compromise on having visible First Nations leadership in this space, or starting and ending the day with ceremony. And that piece of starting and ending the day with First Nations grounding ceremonies, traditional ceremonies, was important for all of us in terms of how we prepare to enter the space, and how that prepares us to enter the space with a good heart and a good mind. But it also puts the bookends and creates the container that this is a First Nation space that we are inviting others into to help us go through a process. And from our non-Indigenous counterparts, we really needed them and appreciated their willingness to enter the space with us in that way.
Miigwech, Marcia. Fabio, the question for you is, how can we find the opportunity behind or even because of the crisis?
Thank you, Adam. I think that can also combine with another answer I could see in the chat, which is if the crisis strengthen the agenda and the opportunities to deal with the agenda. So I think not necessarily it strengthens, of course, the agenda. We can't say that COVID was positive for this agenda, because it was not, as it was not positive for any, probably any social or environmental aspect in Brazil in general. However, we found the initiative in such a stage that a crisis can create more cohesion among the members, right? So, of course, normally we are trying to find common interests and define common agendas, which a crisis poses to all members naturally. So everyone is dealing with COVID. It's not something that we have to find. It's evident, and everyone has to deal with that. So from that, I would say that collaboration can happen, and particularly for the lab, at the stage that the lab found itself, could happen kind of naturally, because many organizations were already trying to work together in different agendas, and then all of a sudden you have an agenda that is impacting everyone, right? So I wouldn't say that necessarily, this cliche of with every opportunity, every crisis comes an opportunity. But I think for collaboration, you can, in the particular case of the COVID and Sustainable Fashion Lab Brazil, it definitely created a common agenda for everyone to deal with, that brought together the members and created a sort of opportunity of, for example, an economic recovery based on sustainable principles. That, of course, without the crisis, we wouldn't be talking about economic recovery, and we wouldn't have had this opportunity to kind of create something from scratch, right? So, yeah, that would be my answer. But I don't think I think we should be very careful in saying that this kind of crisis create a lot of opportunities or strengthen the agenda, because it's actually, of course, doing much harm, especially to vulnerable people in Brazil.
Obrigado, Fabio. Belin, can you give us an example of one measurable outcome from the work that you do? The questioner says they struggle to get hard evidence of better recovery from crisis after interventions like the ones you are working on.
Yes, I can. Can I answer in Spanish, Adam? If I respond in Spanish, the people can
Unfortunately,
get the translation?
No, that won't work. Sorry, we're not.
Okay, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Let me see. I think that the community, it's more care about the health and the house and other things in a crisis. Because, for example, for LGTB, the bag it's the more important than a car or a bicycle. Yes. In this crisis, our clients buy more health insurance than care insurance with high prices and digital events from cell phones, smartphones, the computer, and another channel distributions. So I think that in the crisis, our awareness, insurance awareness, is more highest than in a time without crisis. See, so for our company, the crisis is an opportunity.
Gracias, Belén. Okay, let me ask one last question to all three of you. Given the experiences you have been having, can you think of any particular things to pay attention to or risks that need to be taken into account regarding experimenting, trying out new things in a context of crisis? So I'll invite each of you to say what you want about that, about experimenting or trying out new things or taking risks in a context at a period of crisis. Marcia?
Yeah, it's a great question and something I've certainly been paying a lot of attention to in real time. I think to me, the big risk is that in a time of crisis, in a time of stress, most people are going to want to default to what they are comfortable with, i.e. the status quo, whether that is more likely to produce the outcomes and the results that we want or not. And so the risk with an experimental or creative approach, which we continue to do, is that when there are challenges, how do you sustain the commitment to keep experimenting, to keep being creative, to keep growing, to try to achieve the results you want, as opposed to the forces that will be, well, we tried that, it didn't work, so we're going to go back to the status quo. And so to me, that's one of the biggest risks. I would also observe that the standard of proof or the level of convincing that has to happen in an argument to try something new in a crisis, often quite a bit higher. And that my current sense is the standard of proof or that convincing that you need to do is higher and higher in proportion to how far of a departure it is from the status quo, regardless of whether the status quo is working or not. And so that takes a lot of emotional labor and energy as well. And so I think, again, returning back to that first treatment or that first statement that the status quo is unacceptable, we often have to come back to that truth in order to keep moving forward and trying new things.
Thank you. Fabio?
Yeah, I completely agree with Marcia, first of all. So maybe I would build on something that she said. I think adding to her second point, I think there is a risk that more democratic processes are in favor in this context, because of course you need to develop fast responses and sometimes dialogue and a democratic process take longer. So it's tricky to balance this emergency need with an inclusive process. So I don't have an exact answer for that, but I think it's always a challenge. And linking to Marcia's first point to, how we keep this running in the long term, right? So we create this collaboration around a common agenda, during a crisis, but we also want them to stick together for the time after the crisis, right? And particularly for the Sustainable Fashion Lab, I think there is a possibility that we keep this energy high of working together and create kind of foster or stimulate the sustainability practices in the sector. But as Marcia said, especially in this sector, the winners of the sector have been operating for a long time under some bases that are not very sustainable, and it may be very comfortable for them just to go back to the status quo. So yeah, I would just add to her points and
Thank you.
And finishing.
And Belén, what would you add about trying out new things in a period of crisis?
Yes, the biggest risk is, putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Act as a team, going from theory to action, being more pragmatic with a method, but more pragmatic. If you want, you can.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. I'm overwhelmed, yeah, not only by your contributions this last hour, but by the work you're doing in your three different ways in the front lines of what remains a terrifying situation for many people in many dimensions. So thank you very much for sharing. I'm just going to wrap us up now. So to continue this conversation on social media, please use @RiosPartners and hashtag collaborate to transform. And what I'm going to invite everybody here, all the participants, is to put in the chat a checkout, so something you're leaving with. So I'm going to ask you to put in the chat two things. One word about the feeling you have now, happy, sad, confused, whatever it is. So one word about the feeling you have now as we finish this hour together. And secondly, one new thought that you're taking away from this 1 hour together, an insight, a wondering, a question that you're leaving this webinar with. So one word about the feeling you have now, and a sentence about a new thought that you're taking away from this webinar. Yes, we're seeing this in the chat. Thank you. So this is wonderful. We'll leave this open so you can scroll through it. I want to thank everybody for joining us for this hour. We have made a recording which we'll email to all of you who registered for the webinar. We're continuing to host regular events with our partners on our learning together, our trials and our errors. To keep in touch, please sign up for the newsletter, which is on our website, www.riospartners.com. So thank you all very much. Goodbye. But I'm not going to close this space now because I want you to be able to see what's going on in the chat, which is wonderful. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing you next time.